Good morning, folks. Welcome. As people are coming in from the waiting room, we were waiting for everyone to join us. This is a Zoom issue, but we're all here, so we're excited that you're with us. We are waiting for our university president to join us, and we understand he was in the waiting room. So we're going to try to find him in the waiting room and bring him over onto the panelist side as we get started. There he is, Dr. Jimenez Sandoval. Thank you for finding us this morning. I'm sorry you got lost in the.
No worries. Nice to be here.
Bernadette, we wanted to begin by sharing a PowerPoint, right? Or were you going to begin starting right off the bat?
Let's just begin.
Okay.
Starting off since we're here. So,
yeah.
Good morning to everyone and welcome to our Human Rights Commemoration Day, presented by the Human Rights Coalition of the Central Valley. I am Bernadette Vazquez, and together with Dr. Sue Kapoor, we co-chair the Human Rights Coalition. Our theme this year is Voting Rights are Human Rights. We have distinguished keynote speakers and panelists who will share with you their perspective and their expertise on voting rights and democracy. They will be introduced by our very own Fresno State President, Dr. Saúl Jiménez Sandoval. We thank you for being here. And also from Fresno State, Dr. Andrew Fiala, Ethics Center Director. He will be our moderator this morning. We will also share with you our community partners who support the Human Rights Coalition, and Jim Grant will showcase each partner later on in the program. We begin with a rich land acknowledgement offered by the lovely Marisol Baca, former Fresno Poet Laureate. So we thank you all very much for being here. Marisol?
Thank you, Bernadette, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to read a land acknowledgement. This land that obviously we're virtual, but the land that we're all sitting on, probably, the land that I'm sitting on in the outskirts of Fresno, Sanger, is situated amidst the lands of the diverse Yokuts and Western Mono peoples who have tended the ecosystems of the San Joaquin Valley and Sierra Nevada foothills since time immemorial, and continue to do so today. Before colonization and settlement, there were in fact over 50 connected Yokuts tribes with distinct languages and cultures who shared space with Western Mono peoples in the foothills. These communities had vibrant networks of trade, knowledge sharing, and ecosystem management practices which shaped the landscape we see today. Despite the history of colonial violence and the way it impacts our present, the descendants of the Yokuts and Mono peoples are still here, thriving with cultural practitioners teaching and learning local indigenous languages, working to promote healing. In addition, local tribes provide significant philanthropic support and community engagement that extends far beyond their tribal communities. We are grateful to be in their traditional homelands and acknowledge these vital contributions to our region, our culture, and our future. Thank you.
So now we'd like to invite President Jimenez Sandoval to say a few words of welcome and introduction. And just by the way, Dolores Huerta will be joining us. She's not with us right now, but she will join us a bit later. Saúl, welcome.
Thank you, Andy. It's nice to see you, and it's great to see this incredible panelists today. I want to give you a good morning and offer a warm welcome to this annual Human Rights Day event. Fresno State is proud to serve as the host for this conversation about voting rights as human rights. This is an important issue in our state, in our country, and indeed in our world as well. I'd like to thank the Human Rights Coalition co-chairs, Dr. Surdasang Kapoor and Bernadette Vazquez, for their leadership on this, along with Ethics Center Director, Dr. Andrew Fiala. It is a true honor for us to welcome two civil rights icons this morning, Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, a fellow colleague in the CSU, who is now an incredible leader within the legislature, and an activist leader, Dolores Huerta. We are indebted to both of you for your leadership on so many important issues in California, all across the United States as well. Article 21 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights states that every person has the right, quote, the right to take part in the government of their country directly or through freely chosen representatives, unquote. This is a critical time for voting rights. One of the most fundamental rights is the right to vote. Yet the hard-fought victories of the past are now under attack in the courts and in state legislatures across the country. In these challenging times, it is crucial to continue fighting to defend voting rights in our state, in our nation, and around the world. After Dr. Weber's talk, we will hear from Dolores Huerta. So let me introduce Dolores first, who will join us later on in the panel. Dolores Huerta is a civil rights icon with local roots. Dolores worked with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. Dolores continues her work through the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom given to her by President Obama. She was recognized with the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights as well. We look forward to hearing from Dolores after Dr. Weber speaks, of course. It is now my privilege to introduce California's exceptional Secretary of State. Dr. Shirley Weber is a true pioneer. She became a professor at San Diego State at the age of 23 and received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from UCLA by the age of 26. She retired from the Department of Africana Studies at San Diego State. I wish it were Fresno State, but it is San Diego State after all. After 40 years as a faculty member and several terms as a department chair. She served 4 terms as an assembly member, where she was a leading voice on social justice and equity issues. She also has a long record of accomplishment in improving the quality, affordability, and equal access of higher education. Dr. Weber was sworn in as Secretary of State in January, becoming the first African-American to serve in that position and only the 5th African-American to serve as a state constitutional officer in California's 170-year history. Please welcome California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's good to be on your campus, good to be with you again, and I appreciate your dedication and service to this community.
Nice to see you again.
It's great to see you. I went home and told everybody what an amazing president Fresno had.
Thank you.
Not just committed to Fresno, the campus, but committed to the Fresno, the community. And I really appreciate that, because so often people jump from place to place to place and climb that ladder, but then there are those who stay in places and make a difference. And I really appreciate that. And your warm welcome to me to that campus was just amazing. And so
thank you very much.
It has a very new special place in my heart now because of your leadership. And those in that campus should be very grateful. Thank you so much. So it's good for me to be here, and I'll be here anytime you call, because I recognize the work that you're doing and how important it is. You know, I just got back from Washington, D.C., and I wore this. I got my T-shirt that says voting rights equal economic justice. And it's done by a group of African-American women. And I was in in D.C., because I was a part of a fellow program, the Hunt Fellow, that deals with the issues of education at the state and the national level. So I was there as a fellow, but I knew that there had been a group of African-American women at the National Council of Negro Women who were rallying almost every other week in Washington around the issue of voting rights and just how important it was. And so when I realized I was going to be there, I let them know, and they had me come and do a welcome and express California's ongoing commitment to what they're doing in Washington, the Voting Rights Act that's now before Congress, the various kinds of issues that are being challenged. And it was great to see the individuals, the women and some men, but a large group of individuals who represented Black women organizations across the nation were in Washington arguing on our behalf for making sure that we had some sense of justice and that we did not forget how important voting rights is. You know, voting rights is an extremely important thing. And we had our first real town hall in Fresno discussing it, and with Dolores Huerta, and we plan to do more of those up and down the state. to help young people, but also to remind those of us who are older that that this journey for justice, for social justice, often begins at the voting box. That begins at the polling place. That if we're going to talk about who's representing us and who has our voice, that this democracy is built upon representative government, and you have to participate. We have to participate in that representative government if we're going to basically have our voices heard and seen. And so I'm a kid who grew up initially in Hope, Arkansas, coming to California when I was just a little kid, but having to run from Arkansas to California with my father, mainly because he was standing up for his rights. And he had no rights in Arkansas, despite the fact that his family had been in the United States for generations and generations as former slaves and former slaves. They really had no right. They had no right and no voice to express themselves. They couldn't pick judges. They couldn't vote for who was going to be the governor of the state of Arkansas. Even though the Constitution said you can do this, that they were enfranchised after slavery, we know that the nation and the states in the South, particularly, and some in the North, began to structure ways in which they could nullify a person's vote. That they could basically have poll taxes and various rules and regulations and all kinds of things that literacy tests that were impossible to pass, even if you had PhDs. All these kinds of things were barriers to letting people exercise their right to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was designed to do that. It was designed to take away all of those barriers that existed. And what we saw as a result of removing those barriers, we saw in many southern states the election of Black mayors. We saw that many city council members of those cities that had been majority African American were basically now having representation. We saw that the laws concerning gerrymandering were changed. We saw basically the empowerment of people. The fact that African Americans, those who were Latinos, who were citizens, others could vote. We saw that people then began to exercise their right to vote. And that's why it's so very important, because, you know, when we think about the many of the challenges we face, it has to do with electing the right people, having the right agenda, making sure that our voice is heard through our elected officials, picking people who are going to stand up for us, even in our absence in that physical space. And that's what representation is all about. And so, so it's a fundamental right. And we have always had this in our Constitution. And slowly but surely, as we, quote, form this more perfect union, we've had to make sure that those principles were always applied to everyone equally and fairly. And so it's interesting now, and I've talked to so many people about this, it's interesting that just as we have fought these long battles, and those of you who saw the movie Selma know that whole, if you haven't seen it, you should see it, because it really was about voting rights. It was about people having the right to vote. And the president of the United States says, no, let's talk about economics. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about housing. Everybody wants to talk about those things because they know why those things are important and are essential to your life. But if you don't have the right to vote, all of those things become immaterial, because at some point, someone will come along and take that away from you. You know, they will take those things. And so as a result, the whole civil rights era was really built around two strong principles. One was the right to vote, and the second was the right to an education. That's why the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Brown versus Board of Education of 1954, that's why those two pieces of legislation become the most significant in terms of people looking at it. Because most folks know, my father coming out of the South said to me when I was going to school, get an education because it's the one thing people can't take from you. And once you get those degrees, you get those things behind your name, you get that information, you get that knowledge, they can't take it. They can do things to you, but they can't take away your right. The fact that you can read, that you can analyze, that you can figure out a way to create a life for yourself. So no one can take that from you. And then he said, if you have the right to vote, whatever you have acquired in this life, you then can protect it because you have the right to vote. Whether it's the land that you own, whether it's a property somewhere else, whether it's talking about healthcare or all those things, you have the ability to manipulate, to own it, to basically create it in your own image. And so it becomes important that we recognize that. What is happening now in this country, it's interesting because we have always assumed in our elected officials that they all believe in the right to vote, that they give lip service to the sense of democracy, that they themselves have been the beneficiary of it because they have been voted into office, and so they say that they represent the voice of the people because of that. And so what we've seen is the ongoing attack on the right to vote. Sometimes it's interesting to me because many of the attacks are so blatant, so outrageous, much more than the Klan in the South. I mean, you know, those folks in the South pretended that having the right to vote, that we needed people to be able to be literate in order to be able to understand the messages that were on the ballot, and people who didn't understand shouldn't be voting for stuff that they don't know. And so at least they tried to couch it in some kind of language that made sense for some folks, knowing that behind it, the implementation of the literacy test and the poll taxes were really going to be racist, because they're going to be applied more stringently upon African Americans and Latinos than anybody else. So that if you had a PhD, they might ask you to quote the third line of the Constitution. If you couldn't write at all, they may ask you, who is your brother? And you might tell them, and that meant that you were at least cognizant and literate, and therefore as a person who was white who could only make an X for their name, they would then be allowed to vote. And you, who had all the wherewithals of understanding all of the information and degrees and what have you, I would not be able to vote. But at least in those days, there was some logic behind it. We talk about now that people create laws that says, well, you know, if you're standing in a line, nobody can give you a drink of water in Georgia. If you're in a line, I mean, what kind of craziness is that? How does that even relate to voting? How does that impact voting at all? I mean, so the things are so blatant because what they saw was African Americans and Stacey Abrams in Georgia was organizing and realizing that, okay, they're going to create these very long lines because they're not going to put a lot of polling places in our community. So we're going to have really long lines. And so we don't want people who come from work to be tired and stand in lines and can't vote. So let's at least give them some water on a hot day. Let's make sure they get something to drink. They brought in food trucks. I've been in committee meetings where we sent money for food trucks so that people could eat and be comfortable and go vote. Had absolutely nothing to do with who they were going to vote for. And it wasn't a campaign to say, you know, vote for so-and-so because they gave you a sandwich. So as a result, these folks are just vicious and I mean outrageous in some of the things they're asking. And so we have to be super, super conscious of that, because even though we don't have a lot of those laws coming out of our legislature, you're going to see some of those things on our ballot this coming year, where people talk about voting integrity and they want super, super documentation of who you are and so forth and so on, even though there is no evidence of fraud. And there is no evidence that people are voting who are not the people that they say they're voting. And the fact that we know that if you vote and you're not supposed to vote, and you vote using someone else's name is a felony, and you're going to be prosecuted. But people will use these things to manipulate it. And so what we're seeing now is a barrage, over 500 bills to start talking about restricting the right to vote. We're looking at bills that are saying in the nation, saying that once the vote comes in, the legislature can change the outcome of the vote. I mean, how crazy can that be, that you would vote and you go in and it would show overwhelmingly that in California, we voted for candidate X, and the legislature, the 80 people in the assembly and the 20 in the Senate, 40 in the Senate, could then go back and say, oh, well, but we don't think that's really the way it should be. We're going to throw out these communities, and in essence, take away this vote. I mean, that in itself is something that people don't see in a democracy. You know, we see that in these tyrannical countries where a president walks in and says, I don't like the vote in Zimbabwe, and therefore he throws it out and demands another election. We cannot allow this to happen. I mean, it's happening and it's there. And so it's extremely important what you're doing as a coalition in Central Valley is important. There will be many, many challenges to all kinds of things that are coming up. This is a year of redistricting, and we know that. And redistricting is a powerful act. And despite the fact that we have taken some very important steps at the state to basically make sure that the statewide commission has some sense of impartiality, we know that that doesn't exist everywhere up and down the line. The unfortunate thing is that we have given, we've restricted the level of engagement that elected officials can have in it. But keep in mind, there are many who've been planning and preparing for this for a long time. They have looked at the fact that city council seats, board of supervisor seats, all of those school board seats are going into a direction where there's more diversity in California. And therefore, in order to try to take away that power. Gerrymandering is what people are looking at. And gerrymandering is not old. It's not new. It is an old practice that has been used over and over, where people would draw lines, and you'd be in an area where you'd have in the South 60% African Americans, and yet they would take that 60% and divide it up and throw it into 4 or 5 different districts, and you would find that they were disempowered as a result of redistricting. They could not harness their 60% vote in order to elect one member of a city council in many of our southern states. And so people are looking at that as a possibility in the local elections across the counties and across the state. Many of our cities have done some things to avoid that, but others have not. And so as a result, we're going to see some challenges, and we should, some challenges to the redistricting that comes forward, that for many of the folks, the only recourse will be to go to court to try to get some sense of fairness and justice for the populations that they represent. But keep in mind, the redistricting, it lasts for 10 years, and a whole lot can happen in 10 years. There's a lot of policies, there's a lot of issues that are going to be brought up in the next 10 years where you're going to need a kind of a voice. Many of your registrar voters are appointed by your board of supervisors. That's going to be important, because even though we see the importance of registrar voters and the secretaries of state across the nation, our local level is going to be impacted by who becomes a board of supervisors, because they choose the registrar voter. And that is important in some counties. Some counties it's voted upon, but others is chosen by the board of supervisors. So you want to pay attention. You want to be conscious. You want to be engaged, because these things have lasting effect. Lasting effect. Most folks didn't think that that we would be in the condition we're in now, but when we trace it back to the kinds of things that are happening in Washington, the attacks on voting rights, the attacks on the Constitution and the issues that are there, the things that are before the Supreme Court, and people are nervous about the outcomes of Roe v. Wade and a host of other things. All of those things go back 10 years. 10 years. If we remember how Obama was not allowed to appoint a person to the Supreme Court, remember that for twice. That impact is here. It is facing us right now. And so we then have to be aware of the fact that these things are happening, and as a result, we have to respond. So let me just simply say that we have dedicated our resources in the Secretary of State in the coming election to make sure, and a commitment that I've had since I was in the legislature, to make sure that every person has a right to vote. That we want to make sure that we are reaching out in every nook and cranny of the state for those who traditionally felt they've been disenfranchised or dismissed, that they have a right to vote. And we want to hopefully engage you in helping us to register all of those individuals to vote. That is extremely important. We're making sure that our voting polls and our places are safe and secure. We've had a few issues, but not that many. I've made clear to all the registrar voters that I will not tolerate any attacks on registrar voters, any attacks on people who are working the polls, all those kinds of things, and any intimidation of people trying to get to the polls to vote. I have made that commitment along with our Attorney General, Rob Bonta, that we're going to protect people and the right to vote, and that no one is going to be intimidated as a result of them wanting to simply exercise their God-given right, and that is the right to vote and to protect themselves and the interests of themselves and their family. So we have made that commitment. We're working to make sure that everyone understands that in whether it's a small issue or large issue, that we will not allow people to take over our voting, to intimidate people, and to prevent you from basically exercising your right to vote. We're also putting in a lot of efforts and resources to make sure that you go to vote. It's one thing for us to fight for you to have the right and to stand up for you when you show up at the polls, but then for you to sit at home and think, I don't think I'm going to go, is unacceptable. It is an insult to your ancestors. It's an insult to Dolores Huerta and all those who work so hard to give you a space. And so we're encouraging everyone to go vote. And even if it's difficult, even if people are trying to make it hard for you to vote, we're trying to make it easier. Everybody's going to get a vote by mail ballot, all those kinds of things, more days to vote, so forth and so on. But even in the face of that, we're asking you to basically understand your responsibility to vote and to vote, and to make sure that you and every member of your family votes, because the best way to fight off all of these attacks on us with regards to the right to vote, the best way to do it is to vote, to make sure people know that there is no barrier to me, there is no wall to stop me. And I tell folks, when I look at those who struggle through, whether it's the the great strike in California, whether it was the protest there with Cesar Chavez and others, or whether it's what happened in Montgomery and all around. When I look at those things, I realize that those folks had a commitment that even in the face of dogs, police, attacks, loss of job, loss of income, they were still standing and still present. And we at least can make sure that we exercise that right that they fought so hard to get. And we will continue to work to protect that. So I just want to let you know we're dedicating our resources, our time. We're going to be willing to work with you and with all the other organizations to make sure that people understand the right to vote and that they exercise it. And I want to thank you this morning for having me with you. Thank you.
Dr. Weber, thank you very much. This is inspiring and insightful. I wonder, could I just throw a question your way? While we're sort of also stalling for Dolores to arrive, but not only because we're stalling. What about all the claims about voter fraud that we're hearing from some people in our system? How do you account for that or respond to those sorts of claims and accusations?
You know, and I guess it's, I think part of my issue is that, you know, growing up as an African American in the United States, I'm kind of accustomed to people throwing fraudulent information out about me and about people who live in my neighborhood and who we are and what we do. There is no data, there is no fact that any of that is true. And in fact, President Trump, when he was in office, had a Blue Ribbon Commission designed to go and find the fraud that existed in the election in 2016, and they found none. Okay, so we've had several folks looking. We have, as you notice, there's been a number of audits and audits and audits and audits across the nation, and they found no fraud. We take very great care in securing our elections and testing our machines in advance. And then even after the election, doing a risk limited audit, that we audit the election to see if the results are correct and so forth and so on. So we do a lot to ensure that. When people tell me that they heard there was fraud, they heard that there were so many people who did this, that, or the other, the thing I say to them is that show me the data, show me the information, give me the names, and we will look into it. And normally when I say that in a very calm and professional manner, I never get a response. I don't get the paper. I don't get the, you know, I've had folks to say that and I say, okay, well, that sounds good. And that would be wrong if they did that. Could you please send my office the information, the data, make sure you send your phone number so we know how to call you and let you know what our outcome was in case there was some fluke or something that happened. And generally that we get no response because it is not there. There is no widespread fraud. I mean, I've had people say, well, you know, you sent a dead person a ballot. I said, okay, when did they die? And they said, well, like last week. Okay, well, you know, it takes us about a month to get through all the folks in California who died last month to basically take them off the roll, because we don't want to take people off the roll who aren't dead. I mean, if you call me and tell me so-and-so died, I'm not going to take that off because there may be, I don't know how many people with that same name in California. So we make sure that this is correct. So when people tell us those things, we look into them. We found no fraud. We found no evidence of widespread fraud anywhere. And so and you can imagine that if we had those who bring up the issue would do more than just simply bring up the issue. They would continue with the data and the information and all those kinds of things. And yet we haven't seen that at all. But it is a tactic and it is a strategy to basically start us looking in different directions, to make us lose our focus. Because I tell folks, they say, well, if I'm trying to register people and people say this, that, or the other, I said, well, tell them what I say about send it to me, send it this, and then continue registering people. Do not be intimidated from registering or have them taint the concept of voting and registration with no data, no information that's been found at all.
You know, this, thank you. I mean, I think people just need to keep hearing this, that the evidence is not there, which leads me to a second question for you. And then we'll let you off the call. I know you're a busy person and probably have a bunch of other things to attend to today. You started your talk talking about the two important things. One was the right to vote. The other was the right to education. Yes. And so I'm wondering, could you leave us with some thoughts about civic education and I mean, you know, here we are, this is a university, Fresno State, most of the people on the line are students. How important is it for us to be educated about our system, our constitution, the structure of our government? You know, could you give us some kind of parting thoughts about civic education?
It is extremely important. And I've been talking with our state superintendent and even some in the legislature still concerning the importance of civic education. You know, one of the things I guess, you know, it's interesting that when I talk to young people that they don't understand what the assembly does, what the Senate does. They have no idea that these people control their lives in terms of creating budgets for schools and universities and how do you raise issues and so forth and so on. So it really is important that we understand the system that we live in so that we can use it to our benefit. We can correct it when it's wrong. And we can know when people are manipulating and basically moving the needle in the wrong direction. It is extremely important that people know that their voice counts in a democracy and what a democracy really is. And it's interesting that as I've talked to young people who don't understand even the balance of power, you know, when people don't understand why I'm so concerned sometimes when the Supreme Court is so far to the right or the left and not able to basically adjudicate matters in a fair and just way. Because this country is based on something called a balance of power. You know, when you have the ability of people to make decisions, you want to make sure that those folks have correct information. And if for some reason somebody taints or destroys one portion of the government, you want to make sure that there's a balance, that there's somebody who comes back and says, oh no, we don't do that. And so therefore everything has to be validated. So you have a legislature that should be standing up for what is right and what is just. If for some reason they get wrong, it is the right of the executive branch to veto things, to try to change that. But if you have an executive branch that's gone crazy, you got a Supreme Court. So you've got all these things that need to be balanced. Right now, interestingly enough, out of fear, I say we're out of balance. We're out of balance because we don't have people in Washington standing up for us oftentimes. They will stand up on some issues, but the fact that our Capitol was attacked and an insurrection occurred, they should be outraged because that's an act of treason in a democracy. And so what happens is that yet no one has been tried for treason. You know, you want to overthrow the government and you are not seen as treasonous. How crazy can that be? And so as we look at that, it becomes extremely important. And so education becomes extremely important. African Americans realized when people were denying them the right to vote, that they knew there was something in those books that they needed to know, that they needed to be able to argue for their freedom and for their justice and equality. And they needed to be in positions where they could analyze the data and understand it. I tell my students all the time, they have to be able to not only defend themselves, but defend their families and defend the country with the way they can read, they can analyze, and they understand the data, and they understand the foundation upon which this country was built. You know, one of the reasons why when I was fighting for voting rights for those who had been incarcerated, those who were on parole, is that I said the foundation of this country was no taxation without representation. And a lot of people don't understand that. That means I'm sitting here as a citizen. This is my country. I'm a citizen of this country, and you're taxing me. You're having me pay for the government, and yet I don't have any input into that government. And the way you have input is through the vote. And that's the foundation of this nation. Young people should understand that it wasn't just founded on a tea party that existed. It was founded on the fact that people were being asked to do things, people were representing them supposedly, and yet they had no voice in who represented them. And there was no taxation. They said no T-tax, no, you can't make laws to tax me. And I'm a citizen and I have no voice in how and who you are, because once I have that voice, then I can determine whether or not those taxes are correct or not. So education is critical. We have to not only just be able to read and write, we have to be able to think critically. And when you're at war, that becomes important. And I tell people all the time, if you're poor in this country and you are a person of color, you are always at war, because there are those who want to take away your dignity, your right to exist, and you must be prepared. And I always say there's nothing worse than being at war and thinking you're at peace, period. Okay.
Dr. Weber, thank you very much. This is, again, insightful and inspiring, and we really appreciate your time and sharing your time and energy with Fresno State and the Human Rights Coalition of the Central Valley. Thank you very much.
Thanks for all the work you guys are doing. I appreciate it. Let me know whatever you need, and I look forward to working with you as we move forward. Have a great morning.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you again sometime, I'm sure.
Good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So I think now we're hoping we'd have Dolores with us to speak, but I think it's a great segue to Professor Lisa Bryant, who is one of our panelists. this, we just talked a little bit about historical context and institutional framework. So let me introduce Dr. Lisa Bryant, and then at that point, maybe we'll have Dolores Huerta with us. So, and Lisa, if you're ready to go, this is a good time. So Dr. Lisa Bryant is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. She's also a survey director for the Institute of Leadership and Public Policy. She's done extensive research on voter mobilization, voter registration, voter confidence, and public opinion on fraud in elections and evaluations of local election officials, as well as other election-related projects. We had her listed as affiliated with the League of Women Voters, and she at one point was working with them, and I think has taken a slightly different role with that organization. Maybe you can explain that, Lisa, as well. But let's turn it over to Dr. Lisa Bryant. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Fiala. Nice to be here this morning. I love League of Women Voters, so I just want to send that out there. And I was the director of the student unit. We have a student unit of the League of Women Voters on campus. And then during COVID, most of our members graduated, and then I have been on a research sabbatical this semester, and so I've not been as actively involved. But yes, I was a board member for the League here in Fresno, and I love and admire the work that the League does. And so, but I am also a professor of political science at Fresno State who studies elections and election administration. And so I am speaking in my capacity as a professor today. So as a professor, I'm going to get into a couple of the things that Dr. Weber referenced in her talk and that things that I've been working on. I think one of the things that we often hear when you do surveys or talk to people on the street about elections is like, well, voting's so much easier today. I'm like, why do we still have all of these conversations about voting rights, and voting access? And it is true that voting is much easier today than it has been in many periods in the past, but that doesn't mean that it's still easy or accessible for everybody. So during my research sabbatical, I've been working with the Carter Center, and they're doing a new U.S. democracy project. And anybody who is familiar with the Carter Center's work knows the Carter Center does election observations in developing democracies, right? They don't study U.S. elections, but in light of 2016 and all of the fraud and tampering allegations, and then especially in light of 2020, when we had record numbers of elected officials and elections officers like James, who we're going to hear from in a while, being threatened. We had secretaries of state of various states who actually had to leave their states because they had received so many death threats. We had people questioning the integrity of the election, how it was being run. We had people questioning the election results. In one of the states I've been studying, poll workers were actually followed home by voters and intimidated in that way because they were accused of changing votes. They were accusing poll workers of giving them pens that would actually change votes from one party to another when they filled out their ballot. And so there's a lot of misinformation and malinformation, right? We use the term misinformation, but a lot of this is done with malintent. And so there's malinformation out there about voting as well. And so I think when people say voting is easy, it is easy for some people, but elections and election integrity are sort of also under attack right now. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to pay attention to. And so why do we care about that? And why do we care about it so passionately? I think comes back to the roots of where does our right to vote come from? And what is the importance of the right to vote? And why is it so important that we protect it for all people? And so when I looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it is Human Rights Day, in Article 21, it says, everyone has the right to take part in a government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. And Dr. Weber said, that's always been in our Constitution. Well, it has been in our Constitution, but it was very limited, right? 21-year-old males who owned land in most cases. Early on, there were some religious qualifications even. So if you weren't a Catholic in Maryland, for example, you might not be able to vote. And so our right to vote in this country has evolved over time. In New Mexico, for example, Native Americans, we started with a land observation. Native Americans weren't able to vote until 1948, and so pretty recently. And there are still significant obstructions for Native Americans to be able to vote in the United States. It's actually one of the groups that has the most difficult time being able to vote, because if you live on a pueblo, as many Southwestern Native Americans do, you have two sovereign governments working together. And so putting polling locations on those pueblos becomes difficult. County clerks don't just have the right to decide where to put a location. They have to get approval from the pueblo themselves. And so oftentimes the counties will put it nearest the edge of the pueblo that's closest to the county center. And that often means 60, 70-mile drives for Native Americans to be able to access a polling location. You have a real dedication. And in some cases in November, in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, you have treacherous weather, poorly maintained roads. It becomes very difficult for people to actually access the right to vote, right? And so when we think that we have this legal protection to be able to vote, but sometimes there are not substantive enforcements behind that legal protection, that's one of the reasons that it's important to still study it, to still think about it and talk about it. Because one of the other guarantees under the human rights is that you have the right and opportunity to take part in elections without unreasonable restrictions. And so when we think about restrictions, we think about this idea that how difficult should it be to be able to complete your ballot or to exercise your right to vote? And not only that, how difficult should it be to be able to register? So I talked about, and I don't want to just focus on this, but I talked about Native Americans. On pueblos, they also don't have street addresses. And what's required to register to vote? A street address and a mailing address. And so, you know, in some places now, they use landmarkers to indicate where their homes are, and they use P.O. boxes to get their mail. And there were county clerks who were not accepting of that because they can draw a map in the places where you have a lot of that occurring, a lot of rural places. They could draw a map on their registration, and some county clerks would accept it and some county clerks wouldn't. And so there would be people who couldn't get registered to vote. And so these unreasonable restrictions, waiting in line for a long time, not being able to register to vote just simply because you use a P.O. box, even if you meet all legal eligibility requirements, right? You're 18, you're a US citizen, you're not a convicted felon, depending on the state you live in. Those are restrictions that people see as reasonable, but then there are other things that can be unreasonable that can prevent people to vote. So those are sort of violations of what we think of as human rights. And the idea that we have the right to vote and have a voice in our government comes from, if we go back before the Declaration and back before international law, if we go back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, this idea that government is made up of the people, that we as individuals owned right to self-governance before we joined a community, before we joined a society, and that we are temporarily giving over some of those rights to government. But in order for government to be legitimate and to be seen as legitimate and to enact the will of the people, they have to have a way to know what we want our government to do and how we want our government to function. And so the way that we do that is through elections. Because if you take the connection between representatives and people away and you break that, people will start to view the government as illegitimate. And when people view the government as illegitimate, that's when we see the breakdown of democracy, right? Because it becomes hard for the government to sustain when the people think that the government isn't acting in their interest anymore. Because if you step back as a citizen, I always tell students, step back and go, but the power of the government is my power, right? I'm giving you the power of the government. Where is it derived from? It doesn't have natural power. It has power because we, the people, conceded and said, okay, we're giving up some of our rights because we think that collectively we need a body that will say, here's the interest of all people. But that's our right to take back if we start to view the government as illegitimate. And I mean, that's revolution, right? When you say, the government no longer represents me, I'm taking my power back, we're going to reorganize and come up with something better. And so when our elections start to break down, when the representatives, people start to believe that there's gerrymandered districts because you can't get access to representation from people in certain communities, right? So thinking about everyone having equal access to public service, meaning people from communities should be able legally to be able to get elected into office. But if you have racially gerrymandered districts, which historically, and some would argue currently, we still have in the United States, you're denying people that equal access to public service, the equal access to be a representative and to be represented. And so that's really when people's trust in the system starts to decline. And that's when we start to see democracy at risk. And I think political scientists right now would argue that we are creeping towards that we are moving in our economics, we're moving closer to oligarchy with very high concentrated wealth. But in terms of attacks on elections, in terms of very restrictive voting rights in some places, in terms of questioning the integrity of elected officials and our people who run elections, local election officials, people who are dedicated bureaucrats who've been working just to actually get votes counted for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden, changing the narrative to we can't trust these people because they're trying to game elections. All of this really hints to sort of a breakdown of trust in democracy and sort of a decline in democracy. And so these are things that I think a lot of political scientists and a lot of citizens, a lot of you watching today, are very concerned about where we're heading with this kind of narrative and how much traction it's gained, right? I mean, just, regular ministerial processes like a county commission, or here we would call them board of supervisors in California, certifying the election results. This has not historically in the United States been a big deal. The election is counted, the election is certified, they canvass the votes, and then they present them to the county to confirm. That's not a big deal. But across the country in the last election, there were votes not being certified because there were members similar to we saw in Congress who were saying, no, I'm not going to vote to confirm the results of this election. And it doesn't, the election still stands, the results of that election still legally stand because it's more of a ceremonial process. But the fact that that's going on, the fact that we're seeing this in increasing numbers is something to be concerned about.
Lisa, I'm concerned also. I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the problem of legitimacy. I mean, this is, we're in a crisis of legitimation here in our country. This is really important. Lisa, just in the name of time, I think let's move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Okay.
From your sabbatical too. I appreciate your taking time out of your sabbatical to join us this morning. Our next speaker will be James Kuss, who is the county clerk and registrar voters for the county of Fresno. He was appointed by the Board of Supervisors in March of 2021. He has worked with the elections department since 2016 and as a part-time elections worker for a dozen years prior to that. Since his appointment, James has overseen the successful conduct of 4 elections, including the first statewide recall in 2 decades. He's currently actively conducting or preparing to conduct 3 more elections in the next 6 months. He has also worked with California Voters' Choice Act, the county's Voting Assistance Advisory Committee, and Language Access Advisory Committee, and his work has aimed to ensure that this is the best possible voting experience for all voters in Fresno County. James, thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fiala, and Dr. Bryant going into much more details about the theory and other stuff about voting. I am a bit more of a practical voting. How do we get folks in to vote and get their votes counted? Because as Dr. Weber was saying and Dr. Bryant was saying, that access can be incredibly important in both making it easy for participation, but also kind of preventing participation. And I'd like to say that I am very pleased with the steps that California has made. I think that California is probably the most accessible state at this time. There might be little bits and parts of other states that we can still expand on, but as Dr. Weber mentioned earlier, we are now a 100% vote by mail state beginning on January 1st. We have been already prior to that over the last 2 years in kind of an emergency basis. And I think that's an amazing opportunity of access to all registered voters. I do say that because unfortunately we have still folks out there that are eligible to vote and aren't registered. And that's another aspect of my position, is trying to make that opportunity as easy and open as possible. Along with that vote by mail opportunity across the state, California now as the Voters' Choice Act, which is a way of kind of building on expanding access. I'm very proud to say that Fresno County is one of the, now we're approaching 18 counties, 20 counties that do have or do use the Voters' Choice Act. A wonderful system that expands the amount of time and locations where a voter can go vote. I will admit that that does result in us having fewer locations. And I do get complaints about that fairly regularly from every side of the aisle that, oh, I can't just go down to my school or church on the corner and vote there. And that is something that we're constantly aware of in our process here, that we did lose that kind of neighborhood connection. The trade-off was that instead of having only some 13 hours to go vote, every voter in a Voters' Choice Act county now has over 100 plus hours, almost 120 hours available to those voters across a length of time. So the voter can then make a choice of, all right, I don't have to try to take time off to go vote. I can work, earn my living, support my family, and be able to go vote on Saturday or Sunday or after hours, or use that vote by mail envelope, which of course we really, because hey, there's nothing faster than being able to use that vote by mail envelope at home, where you can sit and read and kind of inform yourself at your own leisure and own pace. So lots of opportunities there. I mentioned registration. Fresno County has 1 million people in it, and the Census Bureau tells me that there's 600,000 that are eligible to vote under the rules currently in California. We only have slightly more than 500,000 currently registered in Fresno County. So there's a missed opportunity, 100,000 potential registered voters who don't know that they have that opportunity. Unfortunately, for some of them, maybe they don't care to make access of that opportunity. We obviously see that, fortunately, across California. Participation rates sometimes are not what we might like them. As Dr. Fiala mentioned, we recently had that recall election. Fresno County barely had just over 50,000 or 50%, pardon me, participation, significantly behind the rest of the state. And we reach out on a constant basis to remind folks, let folks know that elections are coming and what their options are, and to encourage registration. But we still have folks not taking advantage of that. Now, we have seen an increase when we switched to the Voters' Choice Act. I will not claim the Voters' Choice Act does do that. As Dr. Bryant says, we do a lot of research, so you got to take a look at numbers. And I come from a statistics background myself, so I know that 1 or 2 or even 3 elections cannot tell us without very in-depth analysis, and that's not possible coming out of my office at the moment, because we're really busy. And our focus is to make sure that you, the citizens of Fresno and the rest of the state, have that opportunity to vote. So sometimes doing the analysis on some of those statistics, that's a secondary situation. It's really getting out there and getting that vote to occur. I would like to highlight something that Dr. Fiala mentioned there that we have. Even prior to Fresno County switch to the Voters' Choice Act, and this is required by the Voters' Choice Act, but we had this before that. We have a language accessibility advisory committee and an voting accessibility advisory committee. Those are actually present across the state and are now required basically at every county. Some of the smaller counties or less populated counties can kind of team up with other counties, so it's not necessarily one by one. This is an opportunity, and kind of tying back to Dr. Bryant's comments here, that the government comes from the people, and those committees also the committee we have right now looking, we call our Voters Choice Act Advisory Committee, is an opportunity for the public to be directly involved in advising and making the choices or helping make those choices of how access to voting is conducted within their counties. Where are our vote centers going to be? What type of messaging are we sending out prior to an election to try and encourage voting, to educate voters about how ballots work or how voting works? Just a really great opportunity there. And we've had some great participation, sometimes not so great participation. And I hope that's not because folks see that, oh, they've already made they're already a Voters Choice Act county, they're doing this, so they don't need this feedback anymore. Whereas when we were first implementing, we sometimes actually had hundreds of folks giving us feedback there. And so it really is a literal participation by the body politic to address, inform, and create their responsive processes, their ability to interact there. It's a little, we're not quite taking advantage of it at the same level this time around, but those opportunities are going to remain, and we're always looking for that kind of participation. So we look to work with everyone to then ensure that everyone has the opportunity to vote and participate. And we have had complaints about fraud and about questions on that side there. And our response is we have so many procedures and other stuff. We follow those laws at the federal, state level so closely, so many procedures. And then we open up the process to the public. And some folks that complain about the fraud, I don't think they really realize just how open the process is. Your opportunity to participate, we always are hiring and bring best opportunity to learn about the process is always to participate. I always think whenever someone complains about it, well, come and work it, learn it, see all the times you have to sign for the paperwork for us to move materials around and all what we do there. But just the opportunity to come in and see the process. It's open and available, not just for you to vote, but for you to actually come and see what's going on and how we go through to make sure that everything is secure. We're there to protect your access, protect your vote, make sure it's being voted correctly, and you have the opportunity, one might even say responsibility, to come and double check me and see that that's there and that we're doing that. And we let you see that. Let you see that audit process. I'm not going to let you touch the ballots because I don't trust anyone outside, but you don't have to trust me. You can come down and see it yourself and watch that whole process. So that's a lot to say from the kind of practical side of trying to protect everyone's rights there. It really does come down to letting the legislature know they're the ones. People are always telling me, why don't you do this? Well, the legislature is the one that decides how we run elections. We get to do some of the fine details here, but all those rules about vote by mail, all the rules about access and how long we're accepting ballots or you can come in and vote, that's all your representatives that are making those choices. And so you've got to participate, you've got to provide them information to them. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for folks to actually get options in. I do want to say I saw a comment or two questions there. Ranked choice voting, maybe I'd also throw in school age voting, or at least say 16 plus voting, or someone did mention recent change in New York City for non-citizen voting or resident voting. Those are all things that some municipalities have looked at, but those are things that are addressed at the state level. Municipalities can make those choices for themselves locally, but it's limited. And so you do see some ranked choice is available in some cities within California already. even a couple cities in Fresno County are taking a look at those. So
James, let me jump in and just in the effort to make space for our next speaker. Thank you. And by the way, I think your message about participation and getting involved, that's a great opportunity for our students. So if students are watching, I'm sure that you could use them as poll workers. Thank you very much, James. Really appreciate your time this morning. So next we are going to hear from Dolores Huerta. We introduced her earlier, but let me just remind you that she is a local hero in civil rights work and a national hero and frankly a global figure in this field. She is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and she has been recognized with the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights. Dolores, thank you for joining us this morning.
No, thank you very much. And just to add to the conversation following Mr. Kirk's presentation, you know, here in the Central Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley of California, we often have many of the same issues that they have in the South. I always like to say that the Central Valley is more like Alabama than San Francisco. And we have had often challenges from the various electoral areas where they challenge our voters. They say that they're not there. After every election, we have to chase down to make sure that people who voted, that their votes are actually counted. And these are usually goes into the thousands. So we have to be very, very vigilant in terms of our voting procedures here and our voting rights here in the Central Valley. Also, on the redistricting, which are the Dolores Huerta Foundation, we've been doing a lot of work on redistricting. I don't know if our viewers know this, but we do support the independent commission to do the lines for the electoral process. But the commission that is doing going to be drawing the lines, the voting lines right now, there is no representation on that commission from Kern, Tulare, Fresno, Merced, Madera, or Stanislaus County, in Kings County. All of the Valley counties except San Joaquin are not represented on the commission. Okay, that's just a forewarning to everybody out there that's been working on the redistricting. The other thing, when we talk about how human rights are connected with voting rights, one of the things that nobody is talking about this public campaign reform. So because we know that as long as the people that have the wealthiest people, the ones that have the more money, they're the ones that are going to be elected. And ordinary citizens, like people here on this webinar, they cannot get elected because they're never going to have the millions of dollars that it takes to run for a congressional seat or a legislative seat. And so that's something that I say to everybody, let's put this on our agenda, that we have to fight for public campaign financing. And then the other issue that we really have to worry about in terms, and this is a human rights issue, and you might say it's a human survival issue. If we as Homo sapiens are not able to continue to live on our planet because of global warming, then this is a very major threat that we have. And of course, with global warming, we have the other issues of food insecurity. And there are many places, and when we talk about human rights, it's not just about the Central Valley, it's not just about the United States, it's about the world. And we know that there's a lot of food insecurity and that people in many other countries do not have enough food. Even that we know right here again in our blessed San Joaquin Valley that we could produce so much food for the rest of the world, but so much food that we know is not distributed properly, because it's all about profits, it's all about money, it's not about the need for people to eat. And I just want to mention what happened in India recently. I know that we have a lot of people of Indian descent here in the United States, and where the farmers, the Punjab farmers primarily, you know, over 700 of them were actually killed in the demonstrations that they were demonstrating against having the agribusiness model that we have in California imposed upon the Indian farmers in India. And while it appears that that issue has been resolved. It really hasn't, because some of the trade issues are still very prominent and they were not taken care of in the resolution there by India's Prime Minister. So we have so many issues. And I just want to add one more, as if these are not enough, and that is education. So we've really got to make sure that human rights are taught in our schools, the civic rights, the rights of responsibility. Mr. Kurtz has mentioned that you have 100,000 people in Fresno County that are eligible to register to vote, but haven't voted. And we know how many of them that are registered to vote that end up not voting at all. And so we've got to make sure that our school boards, that we include civic education, voting education, human rights education, the whole notion of getting rid of racism, sexism, homophobia, also these issues also have to be taught in our schools. And I know that's a big, long agenda, but the one thing that I know is that everybody that's on this webinar, that we are all committed to preserving and to fight for the human rights of every single individual. Si se puede. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Dolores. Can I ask, are there opportunities for students and young people to get involved with the Dolores Huerta Foundation?
Yes, actually, we have a very big youth program. We're active in the northern part of Los Angeles County, the Antelope Valley, and California City, and Fresno, Kern, and Tulare counties. And yes, please come to our website, doloreshuerta.org. And yes, we invite youth. We have many youth that are involved in our programs that we have right now. They have been involved in the census, in outreach for COVID, against COVID-19, against the COVID, in the redistricting, and many other programs. So yes, we welcome youth. We have a very major youth program in all of these counties. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I know you're very busy this morning and you have a board meeting that you're in the middle of. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. doloreshuerta.org. And si se puede, everybody. Yes, we can. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good morning. See you later. Okay, now it's my privilege to introduce Amy Arambula, who is phoning in to our call from the East Coast. Amy has worked to address the needs of the vulnerable. Through her husband Juan's career in politics, Amy has strengthened relationships with key stakeholders and has come to understand a broad range of public policy issues. She has also worked on numerous political campaigns. She became an attorney in the year 2000. She's worked for the Central California Legal Services, helping low-income residents access healthcare. And she serves on the Fresno EOC board and most recently managed the Education and Leadership Foundation's 2020 census efforts. Her current passion involves helping the Dolores Huerta Foundation in redrawing local supervisor districts. Amy, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I am extremely nervous following a civil rights icon like Dolores Huerta, but I'll do my best. And I too, like our newly appointed Registrar Voters, James Coos, am going to speak about this from the practical side. Basically, our Constitution gives us the right to choose our elected officials. However, it's important to remember that at first, only white men with property were allowed to vote. Then just white men with or without property. And after many decades of slavery and struggle, minorities and women were finally allowed to vote. But that right to vote didn't come easily, and it wasn't until 1965, with passage of the Federal Voting Rights Act, that discriminatory state practices were legally prohibited. Today, we see a big difference between the states. Some, like California, have sought to increase the numbers of people participating in our elections, believing that democracy works best when elected officials are selected by the widest group possible, when voters from non-traditional, low-income, and working families participate in our democracy. Thankfully, in California, we try to make it easier to vote. Voters are automatically registered to vote at DMV offices and you can register to vote even on election day. Vote by mail ballots are now mailed to all active registered voters, and no stamp is required for its return. In Fresno, early voting is available at vote centers up to 11 days before election day. But some local conservatives are perturbed by these changes. Other states also prefer to limit who participates in elections, raising bogus arguments with no proof. They try to make it hard to vote by limiting when you can vote, where and under what conditions you can vote. The old guard is hanging on at all costs, so time is not on their side, given dramatic demographic changes. That's not just happening in other states, however. It's happening right here in Fresno County. I have seen a group of conservatives who want to influence who can vote by making it harder. It seems as if they only want people who look like them and think like them to vote. Under the guise of ensuring the integrity of the voter rolls, many local conservatives clamor about widespread voter fraud. How could Biden beat Trump, Fresno become a purple county, unless dead people and non-citizens voted or people voted twice? This, despite the fact that in my limited experience, it takes great effort to get far too many registered voters to vote even once. Fortunately, federal and state laws provide strict guidelines for canceling a voter's registration. Board Supervisor and Board Chair Steve Brandow believes one of the Board of Supervisors' roles is to restore confidence in the voter rolls, and his fellow supervisors seem reluctant to disappoint their friends. So Registrar Coos has had to spend time and energy summarizing current voter roll maintenance activities to eliminate duplicates, investigate high-density addresses with large numbers of registered voters, and contract with a credit reporting agency to determine voters' current best addresses. Yet they continue to insist more be done to clean up the voter rolls. It's hard to believe, but Fresno supervisors have even discussed instructing our registrar of voters to conduct an in-person visit to all active and inactive voters to check voter addresses and make sure they are legitimately eligible to vote. Supervisor Brandow felt this audit would help regain public confidence, but at what cost? Thankfully, Registrar Coos has discussed the high cost of such an audit, estimated at between $2 to $4 million, the security and health risk to county workers roaming around in neighborhoods, and competing workload concerns. Moreover, the data would quickly be obsolete given how often voters move. I've even heard it suggested that voters should be required to re-register before every election. Sounds like folks want to make it as difficult as possible. The Voters' Choice Act was recently adopted to increase voter turnout and make voting more convenient. Early voting is now available at any vote center, removing the need for provisional ballots. An added advantage, the multiple state-required mailings identify voters who no longer live at the address Elections has on file, so Elections is able to update their voter rolls. But I've heard many suggest we return to the good old days when polls are open one day only, on Election Day. They complain it's expensive to staff vote centers for 4 days or 11 days, unmoved by the likelihood that making early voting convenient encourages greater participation in our democracy. Sturdy, secure ballot drop boxes are currently available 24/7 at over 60 outdoor sites. These same complainers propose drop boxes only be placed inside buildings that lock during non-business hours, due to unsubstantiated security concerns that haven't yet surfaced. These same individuals remain silent when unsecured cardboard file boxes, which were both unlocked and unsupervised, were used as ballot drop boxes inside gun shops, the Farm Bureau, and Republican headquarters. Another issue is calls to the election office to report a vote by mail ballot was never received or lost, and to request a duplicate ballot raised suspicions during the recall election. These supposed quote unquote concerned citizens insisted the registrar implement a new procedure that required voters to submit a written request under penalty of perjury. This created long delays to mail out a blank form, await return of the signed form, and only then would elections mail out a duplicate ballot. Even though the county has safeguards in place to make sure only the first ballot received is counted, in the rare instances, usually the very elderly, where both ballots are returned. Voters were negatively impacted before elections agreed to accept a phone declaration under penalty of perjury. These same individuals distrust the system for verifying a voter's signature on his or her vote by mail ballot, fanned by social media hyperbole. The process of signature verification and staff's internal review of rejected signatures has become quite a challenge, I can only imagine, for election staff. And we really do appreciate that James has opened the process to monitors, and I've been down there, and it's a wonderful operation, easily monitored. But regrettably, this intense monitoring may encourage staff to err on the side of rejecting ballots for mismatched signatures to avoid confrontations. Staff are only human. The result, voters then must return a form to fix or cure their ballot before it's too late, so it can be counted. One final concern, more must be done to ensure vote centers are equitably placed to increase voter turnout. Our recently retired registrar, not our Mr. James Coos, who I've known for years and really is an unbiased professional, but now it's in his hands. So anyhow, our recently retired registrar seemed more focused on avoiding long lines where voters have a history of voting to avoid the wrath of traditional voters, rather than focus, as the Voters' Choice Act requires, on placing vote centers in neighborhoods with lots of eligible voters who are not registered, communities with historically low vote by mail usage or low rates of vehicle ownership, language minority communities, or neighborhoods with high mobility, as these voters have moved and won't receive their vote by mail ballot. We must engage to make sure vote centers are strategically placed in these neighborhoods. Too many vote centers are located on the city's fringe rather than along major thoroughfares in the city's older neighborhoods. For example, Southeast Fresno has no 10-day center, while the 10-day center for the rural West Side is in the tiny community of San Joaquin rather than the more centrally located Kerman. And Southwest Fresno had no vote center identified until shortly before the recall election. And it is hard in some of these poor communities due to lack of public infrastructure to really be able to find spots, but we've got to do better. In conclusion, many of us believe the more people who participate in our electoral process, the better. Our electoral process should encourage participation by infrequent voters, voters with language needs, and other historically marginalized voters, rather than create barriers to their participation. We want our government and our elected leaders to look like and represent our people, all our people. Our Constitution may guarantee our right to vote, but it's up to us to make sure as many people as possible are allowed the opportunity to vote. Efforts to limit and suppress the vote, especially of people who might look and vote differently, are happening in our own backyard, and we need to continue monitoring their efforts and develop ways to minimize and counter those efforts. Too much is at stake.
Amy, thank you. Thank you very much. The equity and geography issues are obviously important. Thank you for putting those on the table for us. I really appreciate it. And thank you for taking your time this morning from the East Coast. And I know you have family obligations going on as well. So thank you very much. Let's move on to our final speaker, who is a student here at Fresno State. We'll get a youth perspective on this. Alex Walker is a senior political science major at Fresno State. He is the president of the College of Social Sciences Student Leadership Council. He is also a College of Social Science honors program student. He researches government legitimacy, and after graduation, he's planning a career in law and public policy. He's involved in community organizations and events that promote democracy and human rights. Alex, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we begin, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. I know it's hard to wake up early on a Saturday morning, and I just really want to extend my appreciation to all the panel speakers, our special guests who have really shared a lot of information with us today. And what I hope to do in my remarks is to provide not only a student perspective, but my perspective as a voter, someone who's new to voting because of my age. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on what overall has been presented today. I think Dr. Weber said it best when she said the best defense we have and the best remedy we have is voting, actually participating. And it's just so incredible because before I was old enough to vote, that was all that was on my mind because I was planning on being a political science major. I was excited to register to vote. And when I was getting my license, I even took advantage of the DMV automatic registration that Amy and James were discussing earlier today. And what I want to kind of emphasize from my experience is that sometimes things will happen that can get in the way, unintentional barriers, because when it was my turn to vote, there was not a record of my voter registration through the DMV. So I had to re-register to vote. And I bring this up because what I think Dr. Weber is trying to emphasize is that you have to be proactive in exercising your rights. You have to be proactive in order to protect it. And I was proactive. I re-registered and I got my stickers. And since the pandemic, this is the first time I've ever voted by mail. And taking care of my family, I also delivered their ballots to the mailbox because there's a way for you to deliver other people's ballots. We have a process for that, verifying with signatures. And another fun fact, like I just want to bring up too, is that even in the mail voting, you get a sticker too. And I bring all this up because I think it's important to share experiences with voting, because a lot of young people, a lot of people in my family, a lot of friends I have just aren't interested in voting because they either feel discouraged, they feel overwhelmed, or they take advantage of the idea that we live in a democracy. And I feel like people rely on that idea a lot. I feel like people think that everything's going to work out, that we live in California, for example, so our rights are going to be protected. But as some of the speakers have established earlier today, there are repressive voting rights bills going around the country. And in addition to that, tools for repression are getting more advanced, technology especially. We see disinformation and misinformation spreading on social media. We see people using voter intimidation tactics, such as using robocalls to discourage people from attending the polls and going to the polls. And we also see a variety of different voices targeting elected officials, targeting people who work in counting the ballots, threatening them, intimidating them. And all this is counter to the idea, because as someone who's really passionate about political science, I'm proud of our voting practices. I'm proud of our participation. We had one of the most secure and highest participation elections in American history this past election. That's something to be proud of. And every time we pass repressive voting rights measures, every time states talk about reducing access to the ballot, that goes against the very progress we've made. Dr. Bryant was discussing authors such as Hobbes and Locke, and how consent is foundational to government legitimacy, something I study myself in my research project. And consent is the most important, and it's also the most powerful tool that we have as voting citizens. And it's the way that we exercise that power. We talk about the human rights article, Article 21. We've expressed a lot about Section 1, which describes that everyone has the right to take part in government of his country or her, it was a gender neutral term when it was authored, directly through free chosen representatives. But I also wanted to take a moment to recognize Section 3 of the article, which describes the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by a secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. And when we reflect on human rights, when we reflect on voting rights in America, and also around the world, it is clear that we live in a more free and fair election than we ever have in history. There's more access than there ever has been in history. But with that access being expanded, we're seeing loss. And that's where I feel like a lot of youth can get a little discouraged, because countless studies have reported that there's over 16 million voters who have been purged from the rolls unnecessarily. During the Georgia election, when Stacey Abrams was running, it has been seen that nearly 70% of the people who didn't have their voter registrations accepted were belonging to Black voters. And margin of 55,000 votes, which is, if we reflect on the 70%, that's 53,000 voter registrations. We also talked about the myths of voter suppression. We talked about the myths of there being voter fraud. And it's been consistently shown in literature that voter fraud is rare and is almost never happens. And when it does happen, what's usually considered voter fraud is actually just clerical errors, which is why it's important that we institute measures such as ballot curing, because a lot of these laws exploit very, very meticulously fine details, such as the fine details of a signature. And I think everyone has a different signature for when they go to the store and sign a receipt, and then the signature that they'll put on a birthday card. And these types of laws can hide in ridiculous nature, such as bills that target letting people have food or water when they're in line. And then there's also direct measures that target what times people can vote and where they can vote, access to the ballot box. We look at Georgia bills that are targeting groups such as Souls to the Polls. We look at other bills throughout the country that enforce strict voter ID, and also what they consider a legitimate ID. In some places, such as in Texas, a gun permit is a legitimate ID, while a student ID is not. And these types of measures, although they might differ throughout the country, they all harm us all, because it all undermines the foundational idea of human rights and the right to vote. I also wanted to take a moment to reflect on some of the remarks made by other panelists in terms of voting participation and what we can do. Because even though there's a lot of repression efforts out there, even though we continue to see those who either unintentionally are just being exploited by others in power who don't really know what's going on and are just reacting out of fear and anger, we also see people with malicious intent trying to create disinformation to harm other people and create efforts to suppress the vote. But there's also expansion of voting rights that we see throughout the country. We see states taking an effort, such as California, to protect the right to vote. And I think with these efforts, the biggest thing I can encourage my fellow students to do and other people in this room is to actually participate, to go out and vote, to register if you're not registered, to take advantage of services such as Ballot Track to see if your ballot was counted, to visit your local offices and get involved, volunteer, work for the census, do what you can to participate. And I wanted to respect the time of our other speakers, so I'll yield the rest of my time. But I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to respond from my perspective. And again, I want to encourage everyone in this room to vote. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. It's just wonderful to hear a student articulate and contribute in this way. So thank you again very much. Thanks very much. I'm going to invite Jim Grant to help us wrap this up. But Alex also, as part of his contribution, made a slideshow that will show our community partners. So I want to share that quickly. And maybe Jim, you can, I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak over this slideshow. Go ahead, Jim, if you want to try to take over and wrap up.
Let's see if this, can you hear me now? We're thanking our community
Yes.
partners from the, obviously from the ACLU, from the Fresno chapter of CFA, the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno, and the Fresno Stonewall Democrats. All of these are members of our coalition trying to make this event every year for Human Rights Day. The Women's International League of Peace and Freedom and Peace Fresno, the Democratic Women in Action, and of course, the Martin Luther King Unity Committee are all involved in making this event annually. The Central Valley Partnership is a strong member. We want to thank all of these members that have been committed not only today, but continually to human rights efforts. The Japanese American Citizens League, Central California District Council, of course, Faith in the Valley with all of that clergy cluster that does so much work here in the Valley and the community organizers, along with the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno. Obviously, the Interfaith Alliance of Central California, committed to causes such as voting rights and the civil discourse and the need to care for our minority communities. And of course, sponsoring the event, Fresno State Ethics Center. We also have a message from the Citizens Climate Lobby, which want to remind us, as obviously Dolores did, the major crisis facing us right now, which does have something to do with voters' rights, because we need to be campaigning with our legislators to care for our climate. If you are interested in learning more, you could reach Connie Young or Andrea de Zubiria at citizensclimatelobby.org. The Interfaith Scholar Weekend wants to be supporting of this event also, and you can go to our website at Interfaith Scholar. We are doing a workshop in March on Sabbath economics. You're all invited. It'll be on Zoom. And that may be our list of all of our,
Yeah.
No, we have so many acknowledgements.
I think there's 2 more slides, Jim.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
Now we get to name some persons that are very involved in this event every year, or especially this year. We have Dr. Sue Kapoor and Bernadette Vasquez co-chairing this fantastic committee, which pulled off again a major success. Voting rights are human rights. Dr. Andrew Fiala, who has been moderating this wonderful conference, the director at the Ethics Center at Fresno State, and our favorite philosopher. We have Dr. Daniel O'Connell, who is the executive director of the Central Valley Partnership and co-author of a brand new book, In the Struggle. We have other members of the committee that planned this event all year long. One would be Gail Gaston, from the who would be representing herself as a community leader and an advocate. Myself, Jim Grant, the chair of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend. Jean Hayes, our representative on the committee from the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, and the Earth Democracy Chair. Jeanette Nishimori would be a community member and a member, obviously, at the United Japanese Christian Church. Katsuyo Howard, Professor Emeritus, retired from California State University, Fresno, very involved in this event as a committee member of the Human Rights Coalition of the Central Valley.
And that's it, Jim. I also noticed Amy has her hand up. So
Oh,
I'm going
Amy.
to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Jim. Thank you very
My-
much for all of your
My
work.
apologies, an error.
So Amy, what can you share?
Nothing, just thank you so much for allowing us all to participate. I've spent my life dealing with voting rights. I learned to write at 6 years old doing postcards back in Boston where mailmen were kind enough to deliver, but I apologize for my hand being up.
No.
Enjoy your weekend.
No problem. And one last thing to say thanks is obviously to each and every one of our keynote speakers and our phenomenal panel. We want to thank individually all of them because each one presented something original, and so many of them were able to make reference to what they heard and learned today to reinforce the basic principle of human rights being the basis of what are our voting rights. We can't thank enough Dr. Shirley Weber, our Secretary of State, for setting us off with a wonderful keynote. Then we want to thank Dolores, who joined us from the middle of a Dolores Huerta Foundation board meeting to be able to make us aware of how we could be participating in this process through joining in some way the Dolores Huerta Foundation. The panelists were the best chosen I think we've ever done. We had the Fresno County Clerk and Registrar of Voters, James Kuss, who could locate this right where the issues are going to be concretized out of our voting process here in county. Then Lisa Bryant was able to have clarified, and even before James spoke, set up some basic principles as a philosopher and as a social scientist over voting as a human right. Then Amy Arambula was able to remind us of the redistricting commitment that is going on, that we must be supportive of and must be combating anything that comes down as non-representative of the people that we are. The map must reflect our community. And then Alex Walker's roundup conclusion, based on his own youth as a student, young voter, was brilliant for being able to remind us on the Human Rights Coalition, we need as much energy coming from the next generation, the younger people, to carry us forward. Thank you, Alex, and all the students that you represent. On that note, I think I turn it over back to Dr. Andrew Fiala.
Thank you, Jim. So, folks, we've done it one more year of human rights celebrations and commemorations. So thanks again to the committee. Thanks to the panelists. I hope that you guys have a great weekend and end of the semester for students. You know, you have to study, so get back to work. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, all of you. Marisol, you're a blessing.
Awesome.
I love you.
Oh, yes. Thank you,
Yeah.
Marcy.
You're a blessing. Thank you all. Thank you. It was wonderful panel, and yeah, just wonderful just to be able to listen, and such informative, wonderful, informative information. If it is recorded, and it is, I'd like it for my classes. That'd be great for students to be able to watch.
Thank you for mentioning that, Marcel. The recording will go up on the Fresno State Ethics Center YouTube page. We'll share that with folks. This has also been live streamed on our Facebook, so you can find the recording there on Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you all. Ben Cruz in behind the scenes. He's the producer of this. Ben, thank you again. He's been the assistant to the Ethics Center all semester. Ben, I say we close this thing down. What do you think? Let's count our way out. 3, 2, 1. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.